Hello and welcome to another episode of The PH. I'm your host, Donnell Christian. We switch gears from the COVID-19 pandemic as we kick off our series on environmental health. On today's episode, we'll discuss water pollution. But first, as usual, let's lay the foundation in our feature segment with some life facts. We often say that water is life, but are we truly mindful of the effect water quality can have on our health and environment? Access to clean water is sometimes taken for granted, but this resource that we use for cooking, cleaning, and as a source of income and food is being polluted by human activities. According to the Worldwide Fund for Nature, water pollution happens when toxic substances enter water bodies and get dissolved in them, lie suspended in the water, or deposit on the seafloor. In today's show, we'll explore two bodies of water: fresh water and the marine environment. Freshwater habitats include ponds, lakes, rivers, and streams, while marine habitats include the ocean and salty seas. So freshwater pollution is pollution that threatens the water sources we rely on, for example, for drinking, and marine pollution is where chemicals and trash are washed or blown into the ocean. Water pollution can be caused by organic, inorganic, and radioactive pollutants. This includes sewage, plastic, and industrial waste. It can occur in groundwater, which is water beneath the Earth's surface that is discharged through springs, rivers, or wells, and surface water, which is mainly found on the surface of the Earth in lakes, the ocean, and wetlands. UN Water states that water pollution has led to 2 billion people lacking access to safe drinking water, and the UN Environment Programme says that 4,000 children die every day from diseases caused by polluted water. Every year, some 1.8 million people, mostly children, are killed by diarrhea caused by polluted water sources. These are shocking figures. With these significant adverse effects on our health and environment, it's clear that there is a need for serious efforts to decrease water pollution. The question is, how can this be achieved? We'll find out more in our experts interview segment. Two very important experts will join us today. Later on, we'll hear from the Jamaica Environment Trust. But our first guest is Program Officer at the United Nations Environment Program, Cartagena Convention Secretariat, Christopher Corbin. Mr. Corbin, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much.
My first question to you is, can you list and discuss a few globally common sources of water pollution for both freshwater and the marine environment?
If you think of the types of activities at a global level that cause pollution, you're thinking, for example, of solid waste, of garbage. That's one of the major pollutants that impacts directly on our environment and on our coastal and marine environment. That's an example of a solid type of pollution. You can also think of liquid contaminants. And I think one of the major ones that concerns all of us is pollution from sewage or domestic wastewater. That contributes a range of problems and individual contaminants that impact on our water resources, that impact on human health. Then we could also consider industrial pollution. And again, this is something that arises from industrial processes, from factories, from the petroleum industry. Here you have a range of contaminants that, again, can contaminate our very precious water resources, from heavy metals like mercury and lead to oil and a range of other organic compounds. You also have pollution that affects the air. And here I'm talking about gases. We have carbon monoxide, we have nitrogen, we have a range of poisonous gases that can impact on our environment, because when those gases end up as air pollution, they can then become dissolved and directly impact on our water resources. And then we would consider the pollution that arises from poor agricultural practices. And here we're talking mostly about pesticides, about nutrients. And again, globally, these are some of the pollutants that most significantly impact our water resources.
What are some of the consequences of water pollution on the environment?
The critical aspect about pollution is that it impacts on our very precious environmental resources, it impacts on water, and it impacts on human health. When you have pollution that in effect is damaging our protection of our coast in this regard, destroying our mangroves, destroying our coral reefs, it makes us as a region, and particularly as small islands, more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So pollution really impacts on our water resources in many, many different ways. It impacts on it directly by contaminating the water and therefore directly affecting our human health and our use of potable water. It affects our coastal and marine environment, and indirectly then also impacts on our coastal and marine ecosystems, which are so important for us in reducing our vulnerability to climate change.
How does water pollution impact public health? So this is a correlation between environmental and human health.
Yeah, that's such an important question. Even now, as the issue of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic has become almost, facing all of us as a global community, and a recognition of the interdependence of us as humans and how we interact with the environment. You also have significant human health impacts from us consuming potable water that has not been adequately treated. And this potable water could be contaminated by viruses and bacteria originating from poorly or partially treated wastewater and sewage. It could be contaminated from heavy metals, from lead and mercury that ends up in our water supply and has significant human health impacts. And then there are instances such as the blue baby syndrome, I think it's called, when you have young babies consuming potable water that is very high in nitrogen. So there are a range of those impacts that are caused directly to humans because we either consume water that has been contaminated by some form of pollutant, or we could also be consuming fish and vegetables and crops and other food supply that perhaps is also not as safe for consumption because of the impact of pollutants.
The World Bank defines the blue economy as a sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth while protecting the environment. In its 2019 report, Not a Minute to Waste, though, it stated that marine pollution is a threat to the blue economy. Can you define this threat?
Yes, that's such a timely question for us, particularly as small islands, because we are looking for recovery, not just recovery from COVID-19, but recovery from all the economic challenges that we face as a region. And the blue economy offers such an opportunity. If we want to enhance our tourism product and we are selling an unpolluted Caribbean Sea, blue sea, white sand, if we have high levels of sewage and high levels of sediment entering into our Caribbean Sea, it means that that is not going to be attractive and is not going to be able to generate revenue. If we want to sustain and expand and enhance on our fishing industry, we need to ensure that then the fish that we consume, that we export, that we sell, are also safe from pollutants. And if we have pollution from the land impacting on marine life, on coastal and marine habitats, it means we are also putting at risk those marine resources that we are seeking to develop and enhance.
In the State of Marine Pollution and Marine Biodiversity reports, what are some of the emerging issues we're seeing in the Caribbean relating to marine pollution and its impacts?
Thanks. And this was really it was a follow-up to the World Bank report, Not a Minute to Waste. But the difference was that we developed it based on pollution data that came from all of the governments. But some of the pollutant trends that we were seeing, the issue of plastics and microplastics, I think, is no longer an emerging issue. It is here. The Caribbean Sea, for example, through some modeling studies we did through the State of Pollution report, had one of the highest concentrations of floating microplastic, floating plastic. And again, not all of this originating from our region, but from outside the region. We confirm that while there were some improvements in the level of wastewater treatment, particularly on sewage, traditionally we use a figure that 75 to 80% of domestic wastewater or sewage enters the Caribbean Sea untreated. Some of the work that we did in our State of Convention area report on pollution suggests that that number now is a little less, somewhere between 60 to 70%. So that's why I mentioned we are seeing improvements, but 60 to 70% is still not acceptable. We really should be seeing a much higher figure because of the impact that sewage has. We continue to see the major impact of nutrients, and now I'm not talking about the healthy nutrients, I'm talking about the nutrients associated with poor agricultural practices, with fertilizer runoff. We are seeing that impacting on the marine environment. We are seeing the dead zones, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, resulting from runoff mainly associated with the Mississippi River. We are seeing it coming from the Amazon, the Orinoco River in South America. And on a smaller scale, we are seeing it for those countries that have fairly large rivers, with the amount of sediment and waste and fertilizer that's running down, especially during heavy rainfalls. And perhaps the point I would end on in terms of one of those emerging issues relates to the pharmaceuticals and the drugs, and some studies done by the University of the West Indies and other universities in the region are starting to detect hormones and pharmaceuticals, even marijuana, in some of our water sources, whether it be rivers or whether be it the marine environment. Still not of these on the environment, but I think it's something that we need to be aware of, and we need to start putting in place measures that would address this.
What role can organizations like donors and academia play in reducing water pollution, particularly in relation to achieving SDGs 6 and 14?
Not any one organization has the solution for this. It has to be done through partnerships. So, for example, there has to be a recognition by the donor community, by the development partners, as to what really are the root causes for the pollution that we are seeing, particularly a pollution that may impact on us being able to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 14 on protecting our coastal and marine environment, protecting our Caribbean Sea, or safeguarding water, or providing adequate sanitation to our population. You have organizations, particularly ones at the regional level, regional intergovernmental bodies of the Caribbean Community, of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, even organizations of the UN, like ourselves, the UN Environment Program. We have a very strong convening power. We have an opportunity to bring the science and present it in a way so that our stakeholders, governments, the general public understand what are the key issues relating to marine pollution.
And what can governments do to enhance these efforts?
Government needs to set the policy. They need to set the policy framework in terms of what the different sectors, both private sector and public sector, will do, and also what's expected of the general public. We need to have appropriate legislation and regulations, and by extension, we need to have enforcement.
Mr. Corbin, thank you so very much for sharing your expertise. It was certainly informative and gave a big picture of the global and regional impacts of water pollution.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Our next and final guest is the Chief Executive Officer at the Jamaica Environment Trust, Dr. Theresa Rodriguez-Moodie. Dr. Moodie, thank you so much for joining the PH. We discussed the issue of water pollution with the United Nations Environment Program within the context of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, but now we want to bring it a little closer to home. Explain what is an alluvium aquifer and a limestone aquifer.
Very simply, an aquifer is really a body of rock or sediment that holds groundwater. Firstly, there are different types of aquifers. We have, and in Jamaica, we have three main types of aquifers. We have alluvium, we have limestone, and we have coastal. Alluvium aquifers is really formed by alluvial deposits, which are sediments that tend to be composed of things like gravel, your sand, your silt that have been deposited by rivers over time. And then we have limestone aquifers, which are those that are composed of, as the word suggests, limestone. And in Jamaica, we have the primary limestone aquifers that we have tend to be of what we call the white limestone group. And they tend to have very high infiltration capacity and allow for predominant drainage, subsurface drainage.
A 2019 report done by the Water Resources Authority states that about 77% of the island's aquifer system have excellent water quality for nitrate. 20% have indicated early deterioration and 3% have indicated elevated nitrates. So elevated nitrate levels are primarily associated with inadequate sewage treatment and have impacted the quality of groundwater within the lower sections of the Kingston Basin, primarily in the Ligani Aquifer. Now, this has caused the abandonment of some wells and compromised quality in other domestic wells. Why do you think this is the case in Kingston against other parishes?
Okay, Kingston that's where most of our population is. Most of it's a city, so we have a very high density of houses, of industries, and not everybody is connected to a central sewage system, and so some of that eventually gets down into our groundwater. We also have, it's a alluvium aquifer, so in terms of the level of treatment that that it goes through, it's not as rigid, and that's not the right word, but it's very, alluvial aquifers tend to be a lot more permeable, so a lot more contaminants can get directly into the aquifer. So when you compare Kingston to other parts of like, for example, St. Thomas, you have more people, more houses, more industries, and so likely to have a lot more discharge.
There were also some noticeable signs of early deterioration regarding nitrate pollution for systems in St. Catherine, Clarendon, and a few other parishes. Can you share your perspective on this data?
Well, in terms of St. Catherine, we can think about the fact that we have a lot of a dense population there as well, but we also have lots of farms. We have agri-parks, we've had sugarcane farming, a lot. St. Elizabeth, same, we have quite a bit of farms. So if you think about those parishes and where we have agriculture, also combined with population, that also gives you an idea of why you'd have high levels of nitrate being found in our groundwater.
In 2017, JET published a review of the legal and policy framework for air and water quality in Jamaica. What were some of the key findings with respect to water quality control?
Okay, so we have some draft standards for marine and water quality, but it doesn't distinguish the different types of waters. So for example, you may have different rivers, but not all rivers can conform to the same set of parameters. You have different marine spaces, but not all open sea versus a harbor. And so we tended to have, we had a standard for ambient water quality and in ambient marine water quality. And it tended to be like a broad blanket. Now, I do know that the government is in the process of revising that. And they are, a working group has been put together to move it away from a one size fits all for the different categories of water. But I don't believe it's going to be, it's still going to be more of a guideline. And so in terms of the regulations and the enforceability of it, you still do have a problem. We also found that while there is monitoring of fresh and coastal waters, it's not frequent enough. And so sometimes you will see that, yes, we monitor, but it may be once or twice a year. And of course, that creates like an average. And so you don't always get the results of immediate discharges that may have taken place. And it didn't always include the full suite of parameters. And that, as you were speaking to, like your nitrates and your sodium and your chlorides, that's what we refer to when we say parameters. And so it didn't always include the full suite of parameters. And another finding was that microbiological parameters were not always included. And that's important. It needs to be included in both the marine and your freshwater standards. I would say that sums it up. But there are more, we had more findings. From the government perspective, from the legislative, if you need to have strong regulations that are, not just guidelines. Guidelines means it's not necessarily enforceable. It's not enforceable. And so that's important for you to take strong action to dissuade pollution. And that also requires monitoring, and monitoring may need to be more frequent. Now, there is a financial component to that because monitoring does have a cost to it. And so that is sometimes you will hear that might sometimes be a challenge, but it is something that would need to be done more frequently for us to have a truer picture of changes and to understand what happens in terms of if there is a discharge, and rather than going after the fact or having somebody report that there has been an impact to the water quality. From the organizational standpoint, especially if you are larger and you do certain activities that has impacts on the water quality. So for example, if you're a large farm, if you're a large manufacturing organization, you are responsible for ensuring that you do have the relevant environmental permits and that you do discharge. If you need to have a wastewater system in place, whatever it is, you need to ensure that you have that in place and that you are also that you are monitoring it for any changes if it's not working properly. Now, I just wanted to mention that some time ago, I do believe that there used to be what they call a pollutant release and transfer register. And I think that was available on the National Environmental Planning Agency's website. And this would collect monitoring data for all the companies that have a license discharge. And that information used to be published online. Now that also allows for greater accountability and for greater participation of the public in monitoring their water sources. I don't believe it's there anymore, or if it is, I'm not sure if it still exists, but I think this is something that is also useful to reinstate, because as the public, you also have a role to play in what some of these big organizations and big industries are doing that may affect your water quality. So you also need to get involved in making sure that if you use, the water that you're using is in fact being treated or is in fact being protected, and you can continue to use it for whatever, if it's fishing, if it's for potable sources, whatever it is, you do have a role to play in ensuring that this quality of water is fit for use, fit for purpose.
And do you have any final comments to share with our viewers, Dr. Rodriguez-Moodie?
I mentioned earlier about the quality, the standards, and my understanding it's moving a little slow, and I think we need to kind of find a way to speed that up, and also moving it away from just a guideline that and to something that is enforceable, so that we protect our quality of water. This is even more important as we are facing the impacts of climate change, which are going to put additional pressure on our water sources. And so it is that much more important for us to protect it from our harmful practices.
It was a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much. And to our viewers, thank you for watching. Connect with us. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at GetThePH. And we leave you with our inspirational quote. Thousands have lived without love, not one without water.